That's why I think it's a bad idea.
Right. So Ben, I read your story last week, developer lending bring more risks than benefits. So I personally think that it's a very bad idea because if banks don't approve loans for certain home buyers, what makes the developers borrowing monies, what makes them think that they can actually service loans to the developers?
I think whether it's good or bad, depends on how you look at it. You could argue that if the developers are very disciplined, very prudent about their lending, there's no risk, there's no credit risk as what the banks may worry. But at the same time, if they are very disciplined and prudent about the whole thing, then there's not very many buyers they could actually lend to. Very few people would be just on the margin that banks don't want to lend them money, but good enough that maybe developers were willing to take the risk.
And you also spoke to some of the bankers. And what's their take on this? Do they feel that this is effective for home buyers?
I think the bank's main concern is the contingency risk because ultimately banks lend a lot of money to property developers as well as property buyers. And the banks are obviously worried about subprime lending to people who are less than prime, right? And that has huge implications on the rest of the industry. And they're thinking like, if we can't do it, how can property developers lend to these people?
So apart from bankers, you also speak to a professor from Sunway University, Dr. Ye Kim Ling. He is also not in favor of letting developers lending money to home buyers, right? But what else did he say?
I mean, he's worried about the moral hazard because developers don't just have an incentive to lend responsibly. They also have an incentive to maximize their sales, and that in fact that means their key objective.
So basically the objectives are different. For property developers, they really want to push their sales out. They want to hit 70% to 75% of the take-up rate. If they don't, then they are in trouble. So, but the thing is, right, I think it's, like what you say, is ineffective. Because if they are really prudent and they only loan money to this certain amount of people, they won't be benefiting a lot of people during that, that fall under the category.
It can be helpful. And I think like one of the developers pointed out, just because some people may abuse it doesn't mean you ban it from everybody. Some people can still use it responsibly and still get some benefit from it. Maybe just that last few buyers that you're helping cross the line, So it can be useful. So to say outright it's a bad idea is not quite right, but at the same time, of course, giving the developers a blank check, is obviously not prudent. The Money Lenders Act doesn't have a lot of oversight, a lot of regulatory framework to make sure that the lending is done responsibly as well. So that's another concern.
Now we have talked about bankers and also this professor from Sunway University. But what about developers? Of course, they welcome the news, they like it, they can push more sales. But overall, you spoke to some of the developers. What are they thinking?
I mean, of course, the immediate knee-jerk reaction is that, yeah, it's great. Anything that can help us sell properties is good. But of course, there's also a bit of cautiousness at the same time because they have to take the risk, and it's not something that they are willing to do necessarily. All this while, they blame the banks for not lending. But when you put a ball in their court, they may be just as reluctant to lend to these low-quality buyers as well.
So this part, I don't really get it, although we spoke about it just now. You say a handful of buyers, they are not qualified to borrow money from the banks, but developers could actually borrow money to them. Who are these people? Are these people like you and me?
Well, the banks are quite strict in their definition of your income and all this, but if a developer may feel personally like you have other sources of income, you may be in sales and you don't have a consistent stream of income, the developer may be willing to lend to you, and take on a slightly higher risk than the bank because they can make it back in the margin of the property sale, obviously.
So of course, these property developers, if they want to borrow money to home buyers, their rates are going to be slightly higher than the banks.
Of course.
Right? So if that is the case, how is that possible for these home buyers to service the loans if they cannot even, promise the banks that they can service the loans to the banks?
I think for starters, it's a misconception that the rates are going to be very, very high. Developers will still have to be competitive on some basis. So lending at 12% won't make sense. They have to keep it as low as possible. And only those with strong balance sheets, maybe those with a lot of cash, will be able to lend because their cost of capital is much lower. So they just need a spread above their cost of capital.
For more on the stories, pick up a copy of The Edge Weekly at all good newsstands.